What is up? It's Lit Book Reviews back in your life. I'm Yoda. With me, as always, is Mace Windu. And today, we're going to tell you we have two lists,
Both.
5 favorite fantasy or sci-fi series that we have read. Now, the main rule is that we have to have read all of the books that are out. So the series might not necessarily be over, but we have read all the books that are currently available. So that being said, we're going to dive right in. So both Andrew and I have our 5 favorite series. We're going to go 5-1. So we will say our favorite series overall for last. I think it's going to be fun. So number 1 for me, I'm going
Wait,
to
number
start
five.
off.
Number five.
Number 5. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Number 5. Number 5 on my list of top 5 favorite fantasy and sci-fi series is going to be the Powder Mage trilogy by Brian
Okay.
McClellan. So this book starts with Promise of Blood. This trilogy is amazing. We read it last year in 2024. Thoroughly enjoyed it. It felt super different just as far as the world building and the magic system. The character work is great. You're mostly dealing with like older characters. The main guy of the series is like in his 50s, which is kind of a different vibe than a lot of your typical fantasy or sci-fi tropes of having really young people. So it's cool. Brian McClellan is a great writer. This is the only work of his that I've read is this trilogy, but he was amazing in this. So I always recommend the Powder Mage trilogy to anyone who's a fan of fantasy. So that's number 5 for me in my top 5. Brian
I like
McClellan,
that.
Powder Mage.
3 books, trilogy. There's a second trilogy after that we have not read.
Right. Yeah.
But anyway.
All right. What's number 5 for you, brother?
Oh, you want to do it that way? Okay.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. We're going back and forth.
Okay. All right, man. Dude, number 5 for me is actually a quartet.
Era 2 of Mistborn.
No. That's funny. I'm still. Who knows if I'll ever finish Era 2? Surely I will one day.
Sure.
Anyway, it is going to be The Faithful and the Fallen series by
Nice.
Jonathan
Okay.
Gwynn. This is honestly one of the first full series I ever read. Anyway, this is very traditional fantasy. Some very traditional tropes, but man, he does it in such a good way. This to me, we've also read the Bloodsworn Saga. And spoiler alert, and I'm going to go ahead and spoiler alert this for you too, just throwing it out there. It's not on either of our lists. That's his newest series. Am I correct in saying that's not in your top 4?
You are correct. It is not in my
Okay.
top 4 or 5.
Yeah. So this to
Or
me is
10.
his best work. Yeah. And it's great, but it's 4 books: Malice, Valor, Ruin, and Wrath. Came out in 2012. Malice did, but man, it's just some like 2 of my all-time favorite. Like if I were to do like a top 5, top 7 favorite fantasy characters, 2 from this series are in that. So
Nice.
anyway,
Okay.
mostly like just to kind of give a preface of what it is, like the story. It's definitely like a chosen one trope of like a young kid who you follow through the series who is this chosen one. There's a little bit of that like, hey, I don't want to be the chosen one thing. But anyway, it's a very good, the classic like, hey, we got all this stuff going on over here, then we got this character that's way over here doing something, and then eventually in the series they meet kind of thing, but they don't really know about each other. But anyway, that's my number 5, The Faithful and the Fallen series, starting off with Malice is book 1.
Very nice. And I didn't do a good job like you did of really explaining what I was saying, so I'll do better in the future.
I believe in
Okay.
you.
Number 4 on the list for me, and I feel like this might be kind of sacrilege to have it so low on the list, but number 4 for me is going to be the Dune series.
Oh,
I love Dune. It's
same.
amazing. I don't think I need to say a ton about Dune. People know what it is. Frank Herbert is a prolific author. His writing is like an acid trip sometimes. I mean, it's just his writing is crazy. His
Yeah.
themes are wild and sometimes really complicated and convoluted. Everything is like in subtext. Nothing is giving to you straight. It is all in the subtext. And sometimes you read a whole book and you're like, I don't know if I got that. I don't know if I got what he was putting down or not. It takes a reread sometimes, I guess. But especially, so here's what I'll say about Dune. First book, obviously, it's amazing.
Must
It's
read.
the best one in the series. You've read the first 3, I think.
4.
4.
Unfortunately, I read 4.
Yeah, you stopped it after the worst one,
God
unfortunately.
Emperor.
Some people love it, but it is the weakest. But so number one is the best in the series, but I
Oh
do
yeah.
think it's worth it if you love Dune to just go through all of it. My second favorite in the series is actually book 5, Heretics of Dune. It is a wild ride. It's just crazy what happens in that book. And one of the characters in that book is probably my second favorite character in the
That
whole
feels like
Dune
a cruel
universe.
ploy. Honestly, this feels like a
It's
setup just to
it's not,
get
bro.
me to
It's
read book
so
5.
different than book 4, than God Emperor. It's so different. But the Dune series in general is amazing. Unfortunately, if you don't know this, it's a 6-book series. It was supposed to be 7. So the 6th book ends with something that's like world changing in a way. And it's just a tragedy that we didn't get Frank's vision. I know his son wrote some books. I'm not reading those. But Dune is great. It's still worth it, even though you didn't finish the series. There is still some closure, and frankly, it can end where it did without answering this big thing it opens up and leaving it as just more of to your imagination type thing. It does work, even though he didn't get to finish it how he had planned. So number
Yeah.
4 for me is going to be the Dune series, and obviously the movies are amazing. But I will say, if you love the movies, that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to love the books. They are very deep, and there's a lot going on, but I
Yeah.
love them. They're great.
That first book's in my top 5 for sure if we're going just straight up books.
Yeah.
I have
No, it's
not, but again, I
amazing.
haven't finished the series, so that's not on my list. All right.
Yeah.
So I think from the last time we did this is a book that was on there, however long ago we did this, and it has fallen since, but it's still near and dear to my heart. Um, so book for it, the fourth rank in my series is going to be the Green Bone Saga by Fonda Lee, which
Okay.
starts off with Jade City. Man, this is
You've been talking
honestly
about this for years. This
I
this
haven't,
series.
and I would like to reread this series because I can't tell if it's been a minute. So I read this book, I want to say in like 2019, 2020. It's one of the first books though that got me back into reading. So like it'll always like have a whole like a special place for me there. Um, Not a ton of people like this is I don't know, maybe it's popular on book talk and whatnot, but it's not necessarily considered, I don't know, it's not as widely talked about as some of the other things we'll have on our series. But anyway, dude, the third book, Jade Legacy, is insane. It's a trilogy. To give like a premise of what it is, it's essentially like The Godfather in like a fictional like Asian like 80s 1980s vibe, like world where they have cars and guns, but like it's more of light magic fantasy. It's an urban fantasy, so it's very different than
Hmm.
anything else honestly that I've ever read even to this day. Definitely not traditional fantasy like Faithful and the Fallen, but dude, it's so good, man. The political moves in this are great. Our friend Jake read it and really liked it too. But
Hmm.
I haven't like necessarily talked to a ton of people who've read it to be able to kind of go back and forth on what they like. But dude, some of the most heartbreaking and twisting moments like I've ever read in a series are in this. But essentially, it follows crime families, um, two opposing crime families, and it's just the back and forth between these two warring crime families. And the
Hmm.
magic system is like it's light, but essentially the guys like turn into almost Power Ranger esque type guys when they wear like these jade, like this diamond or mineral or whatever. It like gives them kind of enhanced speed and strength and that kind of stuff. But that's kind of like the extent of it. It's not like anything crazy. But anyway, dude, the Greenbone Saga. One day we'll have to reread this, and then
Yeah, I still
uh,
haven't read it, so we definitely will hit it at some point soon.
yeah, she has a
You
new
loved it. Jake
series.
loved it. So
She has a new series coming out here this next year. Which, dude, it sounds iffy. She's writing it
mm,
with Bruce Lee's daughter. I shelved it the
huh,
other day. I'll throw it up here. But anyway, but yeah,
interesting.
for number 4 for me, Green Mode Saga, Fonda Lee.
Very nice. All right. Well, we are on to our third picks, our third favorite series. For me, it is going to be the Lycanius trilogy by James Islington. Starts with The
Good
Shadow of
one.
What Was Lost. This series is so good. I feel like the best way to describe this series is it's insane. Like it's just it's like a nonstop wild ride. Like when I think back on it, and you're so invested in the characters. The story is so cool, but you're still like searching for answers like all the way till the very end, and you get this final answer
It's
that,
got some crazy plot.
yeah, to this day, like the next books on my series list, the next series on my list are not technically finished, and you'll see why when we get to them. So it's hard to compare it to other things that I've read, but I could compare it to something like Mistborn, as far as things I finished, or The Powder Mage, or even Dune, I guess. The ending of this story is the best ending I've ever read to anything. It
Yeah.
is so good, man.
It
Like, it
reminds me of
is
The Wheel of Time. This book
really.
is very like the world itself and the magic system
That's
and the
right. I remember
plot,
you
like
saying that
how
when we got
complicated the
into it.
plot was.
Yeah,
Because it's like they're the only downside, and I feel like you've talked about this too, is it's a complex like it's well thought out. The plot is, but like almost to
it
where it
is.
can be a little complicated. But like you said, the ending is
The
so
ending's
satisfying.
crazy, man, and all the books are great. They to me, they
Yeah,
get better as they go. Like, the 3rd one's the best, 2nd one's second, 1st is still amazing. That's what gets you into the series, but it's so good. The ending is just it's so worth it. I will say, and I've seen this people say this on Reddit and such before, I do agree that if you're gonna read this series, you should just read it back to back to back,
oh for sure,
because it can be, I think he does the thing in the beginning where he gives you a recap. I could be
he
misremembering,
does. I think.
but it's still, there's a lot going on, and I think it's more impactful the closer you read it together. We didn't do that necessarily. I think we might have done the second 2 back to back, but the first one
Yeah.
we didn't. But either way,
This
this
is epic
trilogy is
fantasy to me. This is like what
yes.
fantasy. This isn't like Greenbone Saga's urban, like Dune is sci-fi. This is hard, like,
It's epic.
magic,
Mhm.
swords,
World
medieval
building.
lives, medieval,
Yeah. Yeah.
different dimensions, kind of like
Mhm.
it's that kind of
It
deal.
kinda hits, all the different things that you might be looking for in your epic fantasy. It really has all of it, and again, not the all the books are amazing, and all parts of them are really good. There's really no slumps in these books to me, but the ending is what really just seals this as being one of my favorite series of all time. So, I said it when we talked about books we plan to read in 2025. I'm super excited for The Will of the Many, which is right there.
Yeah,
Just
I am
because
too.
I will read anything this man writes for the rest of my life because of this
Agreed.
series. So Lycania's trilogy, highly recommend it.
Yeah. And dude, the only like pitch that I would give that I thought was at least
And I'm
original
so
from what
bad
I
about
had
pitching these.
read
Yeah.
is essentially there's like two different main power groups, but like the thing that got me in this, like in the part like of what's on Goodreads, is it said a young man whose fate is intertwined with Davy, and Davian's like one of the main characters, wakes up in a forest covered in blood with no memory of who he is. So essentially one of the main characters wakes up, has no memory, covered in blood, all these people around him are dead, and then
Mhm.
the story starts. And it's like,
Yeah, and
all
what's
right,
what's cool, just to kinda give you another idea of, like, kinda the premise going in, is that the world is set up to where, like you said, there's these different power groups, but there is a specific power set that you can have in this world that's, like, outlawed. And there's also, if you do have the power set that you're allowed to have, if you misuse it, you get, like, magically castrated, essentially, and it gets taken from you where you become not a zombie necessarily of yourself, but it drains you of that power and maybe a little extra, um, if you can't control it as the authorities deem. So,
yeah,
really interesting plot stuff in there, highly recommend
yeah.
it. What's number 3 for you, brother?
Number three for me, man, is gonna really shock you. I think
I think I know what it is.
if you had to, what's it start with? If you
An
think
S.
no,
Okay, okay.
no,
Not the direction I thought you were going.
not
Okay.
yet, no. So number three for me, dude, is gonna be the Empire of the Vampire series by Jay Kristoff.
Okay,
Believe it or
okay.
not, dude.
Wow, I mean, you
I
love these
know.
books, bro.
Dude, and I
And I
don't know
love
what
it.
this
I just
says
haven't
about
read them.
me, especially because it's so tough because the only thing we have read together of Jay Kristoff is one of the worst books I've ever read. And that is so unfortunate because, dude, it just really, I wish we would have never read Nevernight, is the book that Jesse and I read, and our great idea of doing a March Madness tournament,
Fantasy
which y'all
tournament,
saw.
yeah.
By the way, we'll have that video posted here soon from last
Yeah,
year.
for sure.
But dude, Empire of the Vampire, I think I do. So only the first two books are out: Empire of the Vampire, Empire of the Damned. Last year, Empire of the Damned came out. Um, this book, dude, is It's a vampire story, so obviously with the title. But man, it is such a grim, dark world. Essentially, the premise is you are rehearing a telling of this guy named Gabriel de Leon, who's what's called a silver saint, which means that he is like half vampire, half human, and he is like a vampire slayer. So he was going out to kill. So he has been captured by this, you know, long-standing vampire group, and he is retelling a story of how like he kind of broke the world. So you're kind of
Mm.
left in mystery of like what's going on in the world at the present time, but then he's retelling his story. And so Christoph does a really good job of kind of breaking up the time POVs where he'll start with his, early days and then go back to when he's like in his prime time Silver Saint like badass like thing, and just go back and forth. Um Anyway, the second book was even more so as good. You get a lot more of like present day POVs. In the first book, it's more just him retelling his whole story. This one, dude, it definitely, Christoph likes to do a little something something with a simile and a metaphor, which just is not a fan of. He does it in a more mature way, I think. In this one, he does it in Nevernight. It is still very, I mean, he's taking some liberties with the metaphors and, and whatnot that he's making.
It's the
But
O's that got me, bro. It's the,
well,
"Oh, how we this, that, and the other. Oh,
he,
alas." I'm
he
like, "Dude,
doesn't
get
do
out of here."
that much. It's definitely a French vibe, Gabrielle de Leon. So like,
Right.
you know, eh, Mercy, Mademoiselle, that kind of like a
Mercy.
lot of French words are used.
Yeah.
But anyway, Dark World, essentially vampires have taken over the world and there's no sunset or there's no sun anymore. And so they're trying to figure out how to, you know, make the sun come out again. Cause right now, like, I mean, there's just no like check for these vampires. But anyway, lots of good violence, really good. There's a sword companion in this, dude, which is one of my favorite tropes of all time. A sword that talks is one of my favorites. So if you like Nightblood and Stormlight, that's in this. Um, Lots of death and violence, but then also a lot of twists. So anyway,
Yeah.
Empire of
I'm
the Vampire.
still gonna read this at some point. It just hadn't lined
Yeah.
up where I'm gonna read these thick books while we're reading other stuff, but
Yeah.
I'm gonna give
These
Christoph his due chance again.
I'm gonna reread this one with you too, because I think there was stuff I missed. Like reading the second one, there's like way more world building that I should have paid attention to in the first one that I realized in the second one of like them referring to stuff. And I'm like, oh, okay. But anyway.
Yeah. Alright, cool. So now
Last two,
we are
right?
getting into our last 2, and this is where
Okay.
it's
So
gonna get
this is where
this is gonna get
I think
really
we know
interesting.
though.
So, actually I'm
I
actually
mean,
really curious because I think it's the same 2 series, right?
it's the same two series for sure. And
I'm
dude, I
so
don't know why.
curious about the order. I'm
I
so
got a
curious.
weird feeling we did the same thing.
Okay,
Maybe.
this is gonna be fun. This is gonna be funny. My number 2 favorite series of all time, right now, there's recency bias here, there's a lot going on in my head. Right now, I think my number 2 favorite series of all time is the Stormlight Archive.
Ah! Dude, I have the same order. I have the
Okay,
same
so then
order.
we can just talk freely then about our
Yeah,
next 2.
yeah.
So, Andrew and I both, our second favorite series of all time is the Stormlight Archive. Now, let me go ahead and say, Mistborn is not on this list for me because Stormlight is on this list. I didn't wanna have 2 series by Brandon Sanderson, but if I'm being honest, Mistborn, at the very least, is right there with Powder Mage, might knock Powder Mage out and be the 5th in the top 5 for me.
Okay.
But I decided to not include it because we're already doing this, but I'm still comfortable with leaving it out of my top 5 and it being number 6. So I'm fine with that. But Stormlight Archive is number 2. This
Mm,
series is amazing.
it is.
It's hard for me not to say this is my favorite series, but we'll get into that when we talk about number 1. It's hard for me not to say it's my favorite. It is so good though. I mean, dude, this series is like everything I want from epic fantasy. We kind of said
Yeah.
that with Lycanius, but this is like the primed, longer, more fleshed out version of that. There's more going on in this series. There are more characters. Their books are longer. There's more books. If you don't know the Stormlight Archive, the 5th book just released in December of 2024. We just did a video on it. If you want to check out our thoughts fully on Wind and Truth, book 5. But there are going to be books 6 through 10. So the series isn't over, but it's the end of the first arc. It's going to be 6 or 7 years before we get back into the series. Starts off with the Way of Kings, Way of Kings is amazing. Like, it's just so good, but it's
Yeah.
crazy to think back on what happened in Way of Kings and think about how elementary it is compared to some of the stuff that happens in the later books. But what can we say about this? I mean, the characters are amazing, but to me, this is the world building creme de la creme of
Yeah.
fantasy that I have read so far. If you want
Mhm. If you
epic
intertwine magic system
histories,
and world
yeah,
building together, this is
this is for you. Like, they're gods of the world. There's just so many, all the things that I want, because I love in fantasy or sci-fi when there are gods. I just
yeah,
love that. And the way Brandon utilizes them throughout the whole Cosmere, but especially in Stormlight Archive, is just such a good time, man. His world building is amazing. Um, we'll talk about more about why it's the number one edged it out for me, because I don't want to say too many things before we get there. But the world building is unmatched. This is
yeah,
world building number one for sure. And world building is that's what's crazy about this list for me is world building is actually what I care about the most in fantasy. That's what I'm into. I like seeing the history of the world and understanding how the magic system works, like hard magic, everything being explained. I love all of that. What would you say about the Stormlight Archive?
I would say if it was just the first 3 books and I'm waiting on book 4 and 5 to come out, this is my favorite series of all time.
Yeah,
And
that
that's
that you
again,
might be
that's not
right.
disrespectful because I liked book 4 and 5 too. So like I know
Right.
that saying that's like, oh man, those were disappointments. No, they weren't disappointments. It's just compared to the series had when it was at such an like exponential incline,
Mhm.
it was bound to get to a point where it's like, okay, we can't keep going up. Like, because that's
Right.
how it felt like for me. I know a lot of people have Oathbringer lowered than like Words of Radiance. I think you're the same way. Oathbringer is still my
Oathbringer's
favorite.
number 1. Mhm.
Um, just anyway, not this isn't a spoiler one, so but anyway, 4 and 5 still have huge twists. If anything, like it's
Yeah.
crazy because some of my favorite moments, if I were to rank my top 5 favorite Stormlight moments, 4 and 5 have a lot of those
Dude,
moments. It's just
5
overall,
specifically has my favorite, I think. Like, my
yeah,
favorite moment ever in the Cosmere. So,
yeah,
and maybe number 2. So, yeah, that's I would agree with you. It's so these books are so long and so much goes
yeah,
on. So, it's not even a knock on 4 and 5 that 3 is better. I feel like it's a personal preference thing and who
yeah.
your favorite characters are, that kinda thing.
There's less
Um,
mystery in those books too because now
yeah,
this whole series is built on the mystery of the world, and
right,
you start off at level 0, you go to level 1 at the end of, the Way of Kings, and then, with the Words of Radiance, you're maybe level 2, and then after
right,
Oathbringer, you're like level 3, 4. Well, then after that, it's you're kinda almost everything. It's just kind of these details of the world, like the magic
right.
system you've already got figured out, so he can't necessarily that same,
Yeah,
gotcha is not as
it's a
easy to
different kind
do.
of suspense, yeah.
Yeah.
Agreed.
So, I think it is tougher though because 4 and 5 do feel I mean, they are literally longer, but I think that's if I'm gonna come up with a knock on it, this series is not as rereadable as really any of the series on this because it takes everything in you to read this series. So that's kind of what makes it
Mhm.
great, but also what is
Yeah,
a slight knock because I mean the last book's 1,300 pages.
yeah.
So I
Yeah,
mean,
that's a
it's
good
gonna
point.
take you a good 3 weeks, 2 to 3 weeks if you are reading only that and you're reading a lot of that every day. Like, the average
Yeah.
person is probably gonna read this in a month, you
Yeah,
know?
I mean, when you go on Reddit and see people that are talking about reading these books, a lot of the average readers for this entire series, it's taking them over a month, sometimes 2, just to read
Yeah,
one of these books. Whereas you and I, we would especially with these books, I mean, I grinded this thing out in, like, 5, 6 days. Wind
yeah,
and Truth, I mean, the longest one. But that's because I was just yearning, and I also had no social life that entire time and just read.
yeah.
Books are amazing. I would still it feels
Oh,
crazy. I feel like I'm having to defend why it's number 2 and not number 1
yeah,
because a part of me still feels like it's number 1 in some ways, but overall,
yeah,
number 1 just edged it out just a little bit, and we'll talk about it. But I mean, Adel I agree with something Jake said. Well, our friend Jake said to us either today or yesterday. Adolin is probably my favorite character ever in fiction,
really.
which is one of the characters from Stormlight.
Yeah, yeah,
Probably. This
mhm,
next series, there's a character in particular that might edge him out just a bit, but and especially that last book. I mean, it was Adelin's book. Just so many great
Yeah.
moments. So yeah, I will say some of the things about this series are my favorite of any fantasy or fiction sci-fi. But for reasons we will discuss, it's number two. That's a really good point. If this was just books 1 through 3 we were talking about, it might still be number one. But once you start getting more, that just kind of adds more to it.
Yeah.
Again, I gave all books 5 stars. Still, don't get me wrong, loved every one of them. Plan to reread them as many times as I can in my life. But yeah,
Yeah.
number two of all time for us is going to be the Stormlight Archive for Its Lit
Mhm.
Book Reviews, and I can't wait for Jake to see this and be so mad at me. Um,
Well, it goes from a
number
war theme to a therapy theme. And it's like when
right,
you really look at the themes per book, I mean, if
right,
we're going just on favorite books of all time, yeah, I mean, maybe my favorite book of all time might be Oathbringer, honestly. But like
yeah,
if we're talking series as a whole, the
yeah,
theme goes a different direction that is not what I like to read as much. It's still again though top tier.
top tier for
Anyway,
sure. We can talk more about it once we reveal our number one series. And if you've been keeping up with the channel
something that
lately,
doesn't go to therapy, not a single book.
nobody's going to therapy in this series. They all need it, but they're not going. Number one for Its Lit Book Reviews is the Red Rising series
Mm,
by
mhm.
Pierce Brown.
Yeah.
Um, Dude, I mean, it's amazing.
It
Now,
is.
I will say this off the top. Red Rising, the very first book, is not representative of the rest of the series. I've
Mhm.
talked to people who have only read that first book and they're not really interested in the rest because they
Yeah.
like the first book, but it's not like, they don't want to see that world continued. It is book one is a prologue to the rest of the series.
Yeah.
That's how you have to treat it. And it's a short book, so you should be able to manage that. It's still great. It's still a great book. It's like a much better version of Hunger Games. But
Yeah.
because we all know Hunger Games, it may be less interesting for some people. But just please know that is, I mean, that is
Comparing Dark
the
Age to
surface. I mean,
Red
dude, Dark
Rising
Age
is
compared to Red Rising is just crazy.
yeah.
So let's talk about why Red Rising is number one over Stormlight, because I feel like that's the crux of this
Okay.
video. For me, again, let me clarify. I've said this many times on the channel. When it comes to fantasy and sci-fi, what I typically care about the most is world building. But the reason that Red Rising is above Stormlight for me is the characters. And I
Yeah.
said this in our Lightbringer video. If you want to watch that, check it out. That's the sixth book in the series we just read recently. Dude, I've read several books since I read Lightbringer. I'm still thinking about these characters, dude. I think about every day, dude.
Oh
And
no.
he's not real. And I think about him every day. Like, I love that guy. And that's the character I'm referring to that might edge out Adolin for me. Dude, his character
Yeah,
development over 6 books is just so good, man. Just so
it
good. But
is.
then, and he's not even the main character. You haven't read the series. I'm not even talking about the main character. The main character, Darrow,
No, yeah.
one of the best characters in all of fiction. I mean,
Yeah.
it's just so good. It's so
We have to
epic.
be careful about spoilers with this because we've already
You're right. We do. We gotta be very careful.
but it's just you're right. So characters, which what else is why this is
The
better than
the
or
the
not better, but
maturity
your
of it
favorite?
for me.
Maturity,
Uh,
yes. That's the
it's
main thing for me.
just really, yeah. And I figured I'll let you speak on it.
So this especially after reading, so we read Knights, or I always want to say Knights of Wind and Truth. We read Wind of Truth, and then we read Lightbringer. So we read the last two books of what is available of our two favorite series back to back, literally not even 2 months ago. And the tone is, it cannot be more different. And
Yeah.
that doesn't mean one is bad and one is good. It's just as a 28-year-old man, like I want to see people die, and that's I don't know what that says about me, but I want to see people die, and I don't want to see. I want to see people die at the end of a sword of someone who is messed up that I want to hate with everything in me. Like I
Yeah.
want to be able to hate characters, and
Yeah.
in Stormlight, that is not necessarily. I don't think that's what Brandon Sanderson's trying to do either. To be fair, like if
Right.
I'm so, I
That's not
think
a
what he's
failure on his
accomplishing.
part. It's
No,
just a
yeah,
different.
yeah,
Yeah.
he's showing a different like message, which I think is still a valuable and a real message in its own way. But kind of what we were talking about with Jake is earlier today is that it for me, like how I personally see things, is it is more real to me. There are some of the darkest
Right.
moments in this book and some of the darkest characters who, you get some backstory too, that like why they're doing the things that they're doing, but you don't feel bad for, like, you feel maybe a little, but you're not like, oh man, you know what? I get it, while they're doing these things. No, it's like, hey, this thing was bad, but man, you're out here
Yep.
doing reckless stuff. And that to me is indicative of history. Like when you're looking at long term history, there are
Right.
unfortunately just really bad people that are going to do really bad things. And you can get their backstory and it may shine a little bit of a light, but it is not going to even remotely touch and
Right.
like give you a reason of like, yeah, you know what, I get it. Like you're
Yeah.
not going to get it. And that to me is what's more real. And so the darkness and then also the scope. I mean, we're talking millions of lives, if not billions. So it's a Dune vibe where it feels like the stakes cannot be higher every
Yep.
single time. And so
Yep.
it's tough to replicate that in a world, where it's maybe a couple thousand people. And it's still really important that these people don't die or what the odds you're up against. But, when it's nuclear warfare, I mean, high
Yeah, I
technology,
mean, this is Red
galactic
Rising is Star
space.
Wars level. Red
Yes.
Rising is adult Star Wars. Like,
Yes.
it's violent, and to build off what you said, the reason we yearn for characters to die and for there to be characters that we hate is because if you're gonna present to us a galactic conflict, for it to feel real and for the stakes to feel real, characters that we care about have to die because
Yeah.
that's real. When people go to war, their friends die. It doesn't
Hmm.
matter who they are. It doesn't
And you
matter if
feel
they're the
that.
main character to their story, they die. They
Hmm.
had lives that get cut off, and that's reality, and so it just makes the stakes higher, and it feels the characters feel more tangible because of that. There are
Yeah.
characters in Stormlight that are so unrelatable
Yeah.
because they're so idealistic and virtuistic, and yes, Brandon puts reality into them, but it doesn't feel like the reality that real humans like us would actually feel if we were at war and our friends were
Yeah.
dying.
Yeah.
And again, that's not a mark on Sanderson. That's the world he's built. There is
Yeah.
more, not to act like it's childish, because Stormlight is by no means a YA, but there is more
No.
whimsy in those books than there
Yeah.
are in the Red Rising series. Now, Red Rising will still make you laugh, but
Yeah.
just in a
A
different kind
way
of
different
way,
way.
in a much different way.
Some of the
And another
darkest scenes I've
thing,
ever read are in Red Rising. Like,
oh yeah,
some of the things we mention all the time. Atlas,
you
Al-Raz,
gotta watch out for
bad
Atlas. That's
human
all we'll
being.
say. If you haven't read it, you gotta watch out for Atlas. Another thing that's great though about Red Rising, and Brandon does this to a degree, but it's usually like in the fashion of an interlude that's just a couple of pages. But especially in the later books of the Red Rising series, you are getting a POV that is not traditional to get a POV from. And I don't want to spoil anything, but you get a very untraditional POV in a character. Like, how can I say this? Usually, you love your POV characters, or you at the very least understand and can relate to their decision making. Pierce hands you a little something different with a specific character in the later books. It's not really prevalent in the first three books, but in the later ones, especially, he crafts a character. You love reading the chapters, don't get me wrong, but the character will make you feel all kinds of different emotions. And it's great because you're getting both sides of it. You are seeing what your protagonists that you love are up against, and it's terrifying. You're like, "Oh, no." So it's just there's so many things we could say about this series. I mean, Pierce Brown to me, another thing I love about him, if you don't know already, you can see behind me all this ancient history about Rome, Greece, all that type of stuff. I love reading about ancient history, and Pierce Brown clearly does as well, because there are a lot of Roman and Greek names, but also just concepts. There's even little quotes in different areas of the book that are directly from ancient history. That's really, really cool. So I love that. I mean, if you start
I
throwing
mean,
in some history
Libertas, I
references,
mean, he gives
yeah,
so
all
much
that.
Latin. Yeah, I mean,
Yeah, every part of every book starts with like, part 4 or whatever, and then it has a quote from Homer or
yeah,
Marcus Aurelius or something. Um, and the world is grounded in the real world. It's just way, way, way far in the
yeah,
future. So I love that kind of stuff. I typically am like you, and I don't really care to read an Earth fantasy series,
yeah.
but if it's some dystopian thing and it's far enough removed where we're not really on Earth or the Earth we know, I think it's cool to refer back to the world that we're familiar with if
Yeah.
it's far enough removed. And he does it really well in this series, but the writing is just so good, man. Like it
Mhm.
is just oh, it's so good, dude.
It
It's
is.
it's it's next level. And so yeah, I think for those reasons, really just I think overall love the characters more. I mean, just to name it might be spoilery even to name the characters I love, so I'm not even gonna do that.
Yeah.
I love
I mean,
a
Darrow is the main
dozen of these
character, and
characters.
Darrow is such a good character, man.
He's
And a
so
lot of
good.
times the main characters are not. I mean, I don't know. I guess Kaladin. I guess in your favorite series, if the main character is one of your favorites, then that's probably a good. And it's probably one of your
Yeah,
favorite series. If it's not just the minor characters you like, but I mean, Darrow is such a good character. He's
yeah,
complex. I mean, he's a savage, yet I mean, it's just, he's real in so many different ways. He has so
mhm,
much growth. He has so much regression. Then he has growth again.
yeah.
It's like, I mean,
And it's where
it's
first person shines, bro. This is you and
true.
I
I usually
usually
hate
don't
first person.
we
I
usually don't
forget.
like
Yeah.
it, but it shines in this book. You get to see the
I didn't even
growth
think
of your
about that.
main character over so many years of his life and so many different things happening. And there are times he makes decisions and you're like, Darrow, no, dude, that's the wrong decision,
Mm.
bro. But you get it, like why he's doing it in the moment. And another thing that Pierce does well, bro, that a lot of fiction authors do not have a hold on is there are consequences for actions in this
Oh,
series.
yeah.
Even if you don't see them for a book or two, there are consequences to actions in this series. And that's good. That's realistic.
He is the author that I feel like has the least plot armor out there, which there could be an argument made that a
Sure.
certain character has strong plot armor, but at the same
Right.
time, there are consequences. Like there's plot armor, but then there's severe consequences. So
Right.
they can't just act however they want. But I mean, the deaths in this book are like some deaths can be so fast. I mean, you have a character that it's like, oh man, this character is going to end up playing a big role, dead, immediately dead. Like not even,
Gone.
and I have never read an author who confirms his kills like Pierce
Dude.
Brown. You will know when a character's dead. There's not going to be and that
No
I'm not even
questions
going to try and
asked.
say that if that's a spoiler or not, but if you have to question if a character's dead in the Red Rising series,
They're
that
probably
character's
not.
probably not dead because
Yeah. You're
the
gonna
the
know if they're
deaths,
dead.
yeah, yeah. But
In the
man,
most obvious way possible, you will know
it
that they
is
are dead.
I can't emphasize enough though what you started off by. If you have read Red Rising, the first book, and you're like, I don't know how, I Jesse is being so much more forgiving than I really, when I look back, when I read Red Rising initially, I was like, okay. When I look back, it makes me mad. It honestly makes me mad because it is not what the rest of the series is. Red Rising is, like Jesse said, a juiced up Hunger Games, which I don't really love dark academia. It's like, let's go to this school and have this whatever. He does a good job. I will say it is still a good book, but it is mid B tier for me, whereas all of these other books are, other than maybe Iron Gold, all S tier. Iron Gold is probably A tier.
Yeah.
They're and it's space opera. It goes from fun killing Hunger Games school to space opera with millions of lives at stake. So I mean, it cannot
Mhm.
be more different from
Yeah.
especially Golden Sun is to be so close to Golden Sun. If you have read Red Rising and you're like,
Oh, dude.
it's just not for me, Golden
Read
Sun
Golden Sun.
is potentially the best in the series. I mean, there's an argument
It's
to be
so
made that it
hard to
is the
decide.
best.
It really is. Like, I think
The
you and I
ending
would
of
both have
Golden
a
Sun
tough time.
is crazy.
Yeah, the ending to Golden Sun is unlike in a different way than I was just talking about
Yeah,
Lacania's trilogy's ending. Golden Sun's ending is different than anything I've ever read in a book. I
yeah.
mean, it will floor you, I mean, to the floor, if you
Floor
will.
you to the floor.
So yeah, I mean, we could not recommend this series enough. And to just say again, like
And
I
we don't have
even
much content on this. That's what's crazy, dude. We didn't do a single
we didn't do
video
anything until
for any
Lightbringer.
of them until Lightbringer, which
Yeah,
honestly, looking back, breaks my heart a little bit. But
it does, but we'll reread the series for
for
sure
sure.
within the next couple of years.
Red
So
God, I cannot wait.
cannot
I mean,
wait for
enough
Red God.
for Red God.
Cannot wait. So yeah, again, I will say just to reiterate, even when we started this video, I was teetering as to which of these series was
Same.
going to edge out. Uh, Stormlight Archive, I cannot recommend enough. There are no
True.
knocks on Stormlight for me. Red Rising, just because really just of the level of the stakes and it being darker and feels more mature is really where it wins
And the
out.
readability, man. It
Oh
is a
yeah,
testament to say if you're gonna recommend a book, it's hard to recommend a 1,000-page book to someone who, unfortunately, in today's day and age, most people don't read, and if they read,
right,
it's like, "I'm gonna read a couple books this year."
right.
So pitching a 1,000-page book is tough, whereas, "Hey, just read Red Rising."
Yeah, and that's a good way to put it. If someone came to me and said, "Hey, I'm gonna read one fantasy series before I die, what should it be?" I would say Red Rising before I
Yeah,
would say Stormlight, just because it's more likely that you're gonna get into it and enjoy it, especially if you don't read a ton. Now, if you read a ton, I'm sure there's a lot of people who've read both series that think it's crazy to say Red Rising is better. Everybody's opinion is their own, but if I'm recommending to a novice in reading fantasy and sci-fi, I'm recommending Red Rising, and I'm telling them, "Read Red Rising, eat a snack, and then read Golden Sun. You have not
oh,
started this series until you have read Golden Sun." And it sounds like you liked it a little less than me, probably.
yeah.
It sounds like we're saying Red Rising is terrible. It's
It's
not.
not,
I
yeah.
still gave it, yeah, I gave it 4
I
stars
gave
out
it a
of
4 as
5.
well.
So it's still a great book, but the rest of the series, I mean, it can't be touched. And I'm so excited for Red God. So that's our top 5 fantasy series for It's Lit Book Reviews. Let us know what you think. Let us know what you think about our ranking.
I
Tom,
love that we were aligned on
let us
that.
know what you think about our ranking. We're waiting
Tom's
on you.
never read this series, dude.
That's right. He hadn't read Red Rising. Tom, you've got to. If nothing else is accomplished from this video, Tom Orange, you have to read Red Rising, bro. Dude, we should put in the bottom like a chapter that he can see where it's like
Tom
message.
Orange.
Tom. um, if you guys don't know, we've got a very strong love relationship with Tom Orange, the
Go watch
booktuber
his stuff. You've
who is
probably
much
seen
better
his
than us.
stuff.
Yeah, you probably
Yeah.
have if you're seeing us. Anyway, that's our thoughts on our top 5 favorite series. Let us know what you think. It's Lit Book Reviews out.
Bye.